For the last 4 classes, we've been looking at the first half of Isaiah. And we got right up, we did the 6 woes, and then we just about touched the last 2 chapters. And so we're going to start there tonight, the little apocalypse of Isaiah. And you'll notice that the title is sort of harking back to what we've already considered previously, which we called the major apocalypse. And now we're going to look at the minor apocalypse. And you'll hark back in your minds that we did consider the major apocalypse of Isaiah. And what we're going to discover is that these 2 are really saying the same thing, but use different imagery. But chapter 24 to 27 use language that came out of the 10 burdens. Okay, and it was all about a contrast between 2 worlds, 2 lands, 2 cities, okay, 2 distinctly different places. Well, Isaiah's minor apocalypse is going to take language that's come out of the 6 woes and tags on the end of the 6 woes, but it concentrates this time still on 2 contrasts, 2 contrasting ideas, but particularly not cities, but landscapes. And some of you have your most favourite verses come out of chapter 35. Say to strengthen ye the weak hands and confirm the feeble knees. Say to them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not, behold, your God will come with vengeance. Talking about that time in the future. So what's going on in this section? Well, the 2 contrasts are really between a desert that becomes a garden. So it starts off as you'll notice in chapter 34, come back to chapter 34, you'll notice that there's this great destruction that's going to happen, and it's going to happen on a particular place. You'll see it in verse 5. God's indignation is going to sweep down against Idumea. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse. So Idumea is singled out. You'll see in verse 6, it goes on to say, the sword of Yahweh is filled with blood. So quite a devastating picture, isn't it? It is made fat with fatness and with the blood of lambs and goats and with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Yahweh hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, which is the capital city of Idumea, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. So Bozrah and Idumea. So Edom. You all know where Edom is. You've probably heard of Petra, and down on the southern eastern part of the Dead Sea is Edom. And God singled Edom out as being representative of what he's going to do to all nations that oppose him. So Bozrah, with all its palaces and its places where the princes live and the nobles live, come across to verse 12. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing. So Idumea and Bozrah, the capital city, with all its princes and all its nobles and all its elite, are going to be removed, destroyed. And this place that was once a thriving urban city is going to become a wasteland. And of course, you know that there are many ruins around the world. If you take people out of a certain place, eventually dirt starts to blow in on all the structure, and then little seeds start to grow in that dirt, and then they get bigger and bigger, and they start developing roots that break apart the stonework, and the stonework comes crumbling down. I remember going to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and there's one particular temple that's famous for the trees that are growing out of this once prestigious place where kings would live. And these trees are humongous, and the roots just follow the line of rock down to wherever the dirt was, where it began. It's phenomenal, these trees. And this is what's being described here. No one lives there. It's been vacated of people because God's slaughtered them, and in its place, it's just a wasteland. And so all the princes and the nobles have been pushed out. And in its place, all these animals start coming in. And just think back to the pandemic, when no people were sort of in King William Street, because it's the hustle and bustle of life when everyone's well and no one was in lockdown. And we had kangaroos going down the main street. And they've got pictures of that happening all over the world. When people disappear, the animals come in. And well, verse 11 down to verse 15, all these animals come in. The cormorant, the bittern, verse 11, the owl, the raven. Okay? Verse 14, the wild beasts of the desert shall meet with the wild beasts of the island, the satyr, the screech owl, etc., etc. All these animals, but the unique thing about these animals is that they're all, according to Leviticus, unclean animals. And so what we have is not only two landscapes in this section of Isaiah, chapter 34 and 35, but two states of cleanliness. You get the unclean in chapter 34 and you get the clean in chapter 35. You get the desert in chapter 34 and you get the garden in chapter 35. And come down to verse 17. And he, Yahweh, I've skipped over verse 16 to save a bit of time. And he, Yahweh, hath cast the lot for them. Now, who's the them? Well, it's all the unclean animals. So all these unclean animals have come in, and Yahweh hath cast the lot for them. Now, this is an interesting phrase, cast the lot. I'm not sure if the margin gives you a suggestion here. Can I see? No, doesn't look like it. The idea here is to give the allotment. So cast the lot is talking about a plot of land. We call plots of land allotments. Okay, lot so-and-so. You can still see houses, a land that hasn't had houses built on them. They call them lots, don't they? And they have a number next to it, but then you build a house and then it becomes part of the street numbering. Okay, lot is short for allotment. And these animals are given this allotment. They are given this plot of land. So what God is saying is that he's kicked out all the nobles and all the princes of Edom, representing the representation of all the nations, the sin in the world, and those who support sin, they're removed. And all these animals come in, these unclean animals, and God says, right, here you are. I'm giving you the title deeds to this allotment. It's going to belong to you. You are the owners of this land. And all these unclean animals own this land. And look at the end of verse 17. And he hath cast the lot for them, and his hand hath divided it unto them by line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation shall they, these animals, dwell therein. So they're going to own this land. Well, what's going to happen to these animals and this land? Well, chapter 35 just flows straight on. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. So something Uncle John Martin taught me many years ago in this chapter here. He said Isaiah 35 is carrying on from chapter 34, and you can tell because of the phrase for them. So if you were to colour it in verse 1 of chapter 35, verse 1, you say, well, who are the for them? You trace it back, and it's the they and the them of verse 17, who are the animals of verse 11 to 15. Okay, so we're now getting a bit of an idea of what chapter 35 is about. These animals are going to be glad, these unclean are going to be glad, the wilderness is going to be glad for these unclean animals, because these unclean animals are going to give a change to the landscape of this wilderness that they're currently in. So what do we mean? What we have described here is obviously metaphoric language. It's not literal. It's not talking about real unclean animals. The unclean animals are talking about people who replace the nobles and the princes. And these unclean animals are the Gentiles, are the ones who come to the truth, but they come first of all as unclean. And so God says, I'm going to make the desert as the result of any who pride themselves as being noble in this world in defiance of me. But if you trust in me, if you recognize my supremacy and my sovereignty, because remember the whole of the first half of Isaiah is about God's sovereignty. If you recognize my sovereignty, then I will put you in a garden. It's got all the echoes of Genesis chapter 2, hasn't it? The garden that God made in the beginning, well, he's going to bring that back and give it to those who were once unclean, but actually in chapter 35, these who were unclean do become clean. You'll see that down in verse 8. And an highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. Now, holiness and unholiness are always linked in Leviticus between cleanness and uncleanness. So this is the way of holiness. And to make the point that we're talking about being clean, being holy, it says, the unclean shall not pass over it. So the unclean of chapter 34 must have at some point become clean. They've come to accept the truth as revealed by God. And they become accepted by God, and they're placed, or the territory in which they now are the owners of becomes a garden and blossoms. And so in the background of that picture there, I try to find a photo of flowers blossoming in a desert. And of course, we can see that. And we know that our own Lake Eyre, once every 10 years or so, suddenly just blossoms. And it's got pools and streams and flowers and all the animals that come out. Well, that's going to be a metaphor for what God's going to do for the saints in the future. So, why will they be holy? Why will they be clean? Well, just one final thing in chapter 35. Some of you may know this, but if you don't, this is rather interesting. Verse 8 again says this, and an highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men. You will notice in the margin that there's a bit of trouble with that translation. Instead of it, they've put it as for he shall be with them. For he shall be with them. In fact, Rotherham says, he himself shall be traveling with them on the way. Who's this he? Who's this he that's traveling with the group that are now clean? Well, I'm going to suggest that you could prove this. We haven't got time tonight, so write this next to verse 8. Mark 10, verse 46 to 52, which is a picture in Mark's gospel of Jesus walking on the way, and an unclean man called Bartimaeus, his name means unclean. In fact, Bartimaeus means son of the unclean. Okay, so he's the unclean of the unclean. And he's sitting by the side and he's blind and he's healed, and then he joins Jesus on the way. That's verse 8. That's exactly what happens. So Jesus is the one who is joining them on the way. He himself shall be there. And that's why they are all clean. So this is the king that's been spoken about in the whole of the first half. Now, it's just interesting that the two apocalypses, the major one and the minor one, pick up language in the destruction elements that sort of parallel each other from other parts of Scripture that we already know. So Isaiah 24 to 27 uses the description of the destructive language as language of the flood. The heavens were opening and the deeps in the earth broke up and all the water came and flooded the earth. Well, that's straight out of Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, isn't it? Whereas in chapter 34 and 35, particularly chapter 34, you'll see in verse 9, and the streams thereof shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land thereof shall become burning pitch. That's the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you get a picture of the end of the age as it is according to the days of Noah, and a picture of the end of the age as it is according to the days of Lot. Luke 17, Jesus picks up those two aspects to say that's exactly what it's going to be like at the time of the end. So where's he getting all that from? Well, I would suggest that he's seeing these two, and we saw how last class he quotes from Isaiah 24 to 27 in Luke 21 quite extensively. Now, the very last verse of chapter 35, of verse 8, talks about a highway and a way. And then in verse 10, and the ransomed of the Lord, the ransomed of Yahweh shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And that concludes the first half. And so now we get these 4 chapters that we've been talking about, 36, 37, 38, and 39, which is like 2 narrative stories sort of like plonked in the middle and seem unrelated, but we've seen that they actually act like a hinge holding the 2 halves together. And so the last verse of the first half, or the last few verses, ends with a highway and the ransom returning to Zion. Well, how does chapter 40 open up? Which is the beginning of the second half. Well, you get your introductory verses in verse 1 and 2. Comfort ye my people, speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem. Cry unto her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of Yahweh's hand double for all her sins. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness. Prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So we ended with a highway in the first half, and people walking on this highway to go up to Jerusalem. And we start with a highway in the second half. But the difference is that this highway has to be built. And the way you build a highway is that you fill in all the valleys and you chop down all the hills, don't you? You see how they make roads around here? Your Southern Expressway, the sort of 3-lane one and then the 4-lane one over how many years? They had to chop down all the hills and fill in all the valleys. Well, verse 4 says that every valley shall be exalted, filled up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight and the rough places plain. And so this highway is being built in the desert. What for? Well, in the second half, we now move away from Assyria. I'll come back to that one in a minute. And now we're projected forward 100 years to when they are dominated by Babylon. And of course, when they came out of Babylon to come back to Jerusalem, Babylon is across the desert. Jerusalem, just there by the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, and directly east, Babylon. But of course, it's a desert. And unless you go up to Haran and come all the way down from the north, if you want to come directly across, you have to go across a desert. And so God says, I'm going to build a highway, and I'm going to take you straight from Babylon to Jerusalem across this highway. The same highway that was mentioned at the end of chapter 35. So we know that if we took chapter 36, 37, 38, and 39 out of the record, it would flow straight on. Something we recognized way back in chapter 2 to 12. The two stories, take them out, and it would just read and flow through. Well, the big story of Isaiah is exactly the same. And so you have these two halves. But the thing is that this second half, we've called it the book of comfort, which is how it opens up in verse 1. 3 times the word comfort is used in verse 1 and verse 2. Can anyone... Oh, yeah, I've got it on the screen already. I was going to say, can you remember how many times it occurs in the first half? Barely at all. Once in chapter 12. Like, that's not the theme of the first half. The theme of the first half is judgment. Judgment's coming. Hence, we've been calling it the book of judgment. Now, it's such a different flavour, such a different take, such a different direction. All those words there on the right now become the theme of the second half. Salvation, joy, redemption, light, and of course the Gentiles being included, all of which did occur in the first half, but very minimal, wasn't really part of the theme. Now it just opens up. The tenor of the book completely changes, which is why some say that a different Isaiah wrote this. But we're suggesting that can't be. He's just attacking a different theme because Babylon means something different to Assyria. Assyria was the brutal face of sin, remember? Babylon is the friendly face of sin, the seducing face of sin, okay? Whereas Assyria is the tyrannical, despotic face of sin. Hezekiah has dealt with that with God's power and help, and Sennacherib went home. How do you deal with Babylon? Well, that's what the whole of the second half is all about. And of course, the major ideas of the first half were about kingship and leadership. But the second half, we don't read about kings. Okay, when individuals are talked about, they're either servants or shepherds. We read about servants and service, not kingship. Just a little aside, I did hint at it in another class, but I just thought it'd be worth putting here because, see those 4 words? They are the theme of Isaiah. Judgment goes with kingship, doesn't it? Judgment and kingship. Comfort and service. How do they go together? Well, I'll explain that as we go through tonight and the next class, but just look at those 4 words. They are the key ideas and thoughts of the whole book of Isaiah, which is all about the salvation of God. And you say, what's so special about that? Well, kingship and service and judgment and comfort are the 4 categories that make up a person's life, an individual's life. You're either a leader or a follower at any given moment. Everyone has to, unless you live in a cave somewhere on an island and never meet another person ever, all right? Like Robinson Crusoe or someone like that, and you don't have to answer to anybody. But if you're in relationships, if you're in contact with people, you will be a follower, except for the times when you're a leader. Leaders and followers. But how do leaders and followers interact? Well, by 2 ways. By either providing information or providing inspiration, but ideally providing both. you need to provide both. Information is everything to do with your head. Inspiration is everything to do with your heart. So we're talking about things that are logical and we're talking about things that are emotional. That's what a person is, isn't it? We use our head and we use our heart. And we say they've got to be put together and be balanced. People that are emotional and don't use their head will fall over. People that just use their head and never have empathy or sympathy will fall over. All right? Relationships between leaders and followers require these two things, because these two things really make up the character of God. On the one hand, he's got his truth, the logic. On the other hand, he's got his love, his emotions, his feelings. That's who God is, okay? And he wants you to do that when you're a leader, and he also wants you to do that when you're a follower, okay? If you only have 3 of those things, it'll fall over. Now, how does this fit in the New Testament with the one who is God's salvation? Well, could you, out of the 4 Gospels, identify one as being the gospel of leadership? Anyone want to hazard a guess? You've probably done a bit of work on this at different stages. Matthew, all right? Could you identify a gospel of service? Luke? I think it's Mark, all right? And we could go off on another 6 nights on each one of those and build a case for each one, okay? What about a gospel of truth? That is a bit more tricky. You've got to dig a bit deeper. But which gospel uses the word truth more than the whole of the New Testament put together? John, all right? And a gospel of compassion? It's Luke, all right? So, Matthew is the gospel of the king. Mark is the gospel of the servant. John is the gospel of the judge, I'm going to suggest. And some of you have listened to Brother Roger Lewis on this. I think he does an excellent job and he's identified these characteristics and I think they fit beautifully. And of course, Luke is the gospel of the priest. And the beautiful thing about all of these is that the essential quality of each one of those is just that one thing. The gospel, the essential quality of a king is to lead. The essential quality of a servant is to serve. The minute he's leading, he's not a servant anymore. The essential quality of a priest, according to Hebrews 5, verse 2, is to show compassion on the ignorant and them who are out of the way. That's the one thing that's identified that a priest must have. And of course, the essential quality a judge must have, you go to any courtroom here in Adelaide, all he's wanting is the truth, isn't he? He's looking for the truth. He doesn't care about your feelings. He doesn't care about your emotions and how hysterical you are or anything like that. He just wants to find the truth. Isaiah already had all of these things back here, and each gospel picks them up. It's my reasons why they had to be 4 gospels. Couldn't be 3, couldn't be 5, had to be 4, because each one looks at a characteristic that makes up a human being. And to get the perfect human being, you had to have all 4 areas perfect. So that leads into this book of comfort. Now, the second half of Isaiah is itself split into 2 parts. And we'll be looking and focusing deeper on chapter 56 to 65, remembering that the epilogue is at the end, chapter 66, which married up as the bookend with chapter 1. But we will be dabbling in both as we go through because they are linked together. And I'm going to highlight why there's a need for 2 halves right from the outset by what you see on the screen there, because I've been saying the second half is Assyria dominated, okay? The power that dominates them is Babylon. But actually, Babylon only is referred to really up to chapter 55. And then neither Assyria or Babylon come up again in the last little bit. So I've been sneakily holding that back, been showing you a picture with Assyria on one side and Babylon on the other. But actually, there is a change of theme from either of those two when you get to chapter 56. And it's the reason why some even think that there's 3 Isaiahs, because there is a different flow of thought in chapter 56 to 65. And so some say that there's Deuto Isaiah and Trito Isaiah. But it's not. It's the one Isaiah. He's focusing all the time on different things. And what happens in the second half in this book of comfort, God wants to rescue them from Babylon. And the way he rescues them from Babylon is very different to the way he rescues them from Assyria. Because you remember that they did go into Babylon. And in Babylon, they had a wonderful life. All right? They didn't find it hard in Babylon. Just come back to chapter 40, verse 1 again, and just picture you sitting in Babylon, all right, with your university degree in your hand. You've had your diploma given to you, okay? You're a university student that's been allowed to eat the king's meat and drink the king's drink, and then you're given a job, and then you're given a house, okay? And they say, and the archaeologists have discovered that in Babylon, in the city of Babylon, houses were 3 stories high, and that they had the technology to bring running water right into your house, like right into your kitchen. And so life was pretty good in Babylon. And you had all the comfort that you could ever want. The creature comforts of Babylon were rated highly. And God says through Isaiah, comfort my people. And you're saying, well, I'm pretty comfortable where I am. Why do I need any saving from Babylon? Well, the whole of the second half is showing why you need to be saved from Babylon just as much as you needed saving from Assyria. And the reason being is because it's still sin. It's a friendly face of sin. Oh yes, they're going to put their arm around you, a bit like that lion in Daniel 7, the second phase of the lion empire. The first phase was the Assyrian on all fours. That was ferocious. But then he stood up and his wings were plucked away and a man's heart was given to him. And he said, I want to be your friend. But he's still a lion. And God says, you need saving from Babylon. Well, the people in Babylon, so the people in Babylon were saying, salvation, we need saving? No, I don't think so. God says you do. You need salvation. So in the first half of the second half, God is going to show them that the gods of Babylon are not real. So you might have this sense that Babylon is the place to be. It's rocking, you know, it's a great gig up there in Babylon, but it's not all that it's cracked up to be because the system is based on sin and it will fall over. And you will fall with it. Now, we know that already because God's already done some prophecies about Babylon back in chapter 13 and 14 and the major apocalypse of Isaiah. He already told you what's going to happen to Babylon. Babylon will fall over. And they're going to sort of say to Isaiah, or Isaiah won't be on the scene by then, but those who are promoting the book of Isaiah, to those in Babylon, like Daniel and faithful men like that, God wants to save you. But of course, the question is going to come just the same as it came to those in Egypt. Moses anticipated, they're going to say, yeah, but who is this God? What's his name? And so what you get is that God wants to show who he is. There's only one true God. And so the question is, do you serve him or do you not? Who are you serving? Are you serving the gods of Babylon? Because that's where you want to stay, then that's who you're going to serve. Or do you want to serve the true God? Well, if you do want to serve the true God, that might mean getting out of your comfort zone up there in Babylon and trekking back across the desert, back to Jerusalem, to the waste places of Jerusalem. So the question that's going to be sort of zoned in on in this section is, who is the true servant that God wants to save? And of course, you know this, that there is a singular servant who's identified in this section who God will save, and he'll be the first servant to save. The coming, compassionate, obedient servant. That's who God is going to save. But of course, Israel think that they are God's servant and that God will save them. And so I said that the word servant doesn't occur much in the first half. Suddenly there's an explosion of the word servant in the second half. But it's all only just in this section between chapter 40 and 55. 20 times, servant, the servant, the servant, the servant, my servant. Whereas in the second part of this book of comfort, God is not going to show them who to serve. He wants to show how to serve. Because it's one thing to identify who the true God is. Once you know who the true God is, okay, you eliminate all the other gods like Buddha and Allah and whoever else you want to, throw in the mix, the gods of Babylon, the gods of Egypt. You eliminate all of them and you say there's only one true God. Okay. But there's also only one true way to worship him, isn't there? And we know that many will, in Matthew 7, get to the judgment seat of Jesus Christ and say, well, we've served God. We know who the true God is and we've served him. Many shall say in that day, have we not, done all these wonderful things and said them in your name? And Jesus is going to say, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. They didn't worship false gods. They said that they and understood who the true God is, but they didn't worship him the right way. So these are the two questions that are going to be answered in this second half. So the first part, who is the true servant? We'll find out who that is. The second part is, who are the true servants? And so the interesting thing is that the word servants occurs and not the word servant in this part 11 times. So servant, servants. Clearly the second half is all about service. All right? All about service. Who to serve and how to serve. That's the two questions. That's really what the second half of Isaiah is all about. And of course, to be one of the true servants, chapter 56 to 66, is to follow, first of all, the true servant. So the true servant sets the tone, sets the way, and the true servants will follow him. And we're going to see that one of the major traits of the true servant is his compassion. Therefore, one of the major traits of the servants, the true servants, is their compassion. Okay? And if you haven't got compassion, then you're legalistic, and that will come up next class. So, chapter 40 to 55 is the section where Babylon is the power that's mentioned, and they're still living or coming home from Babylon. Okay? 56 to 65 is Jerusalem and beyond. No more Assyria, no more Babylon. But 40 to 55 can be distinctly split into the chapters when they're still in Babylon and then the chapters when they're leaving Babylon. So chapter 40 to 48, verse 19, is when they're still in Babylon. So I've called this section Yahweh is Supreme. In fact, this section is sort of like the best chapter in the Bible to use for a public lecture, isn't it? It's all the language of first principles. It's showing you who the true God is. God's going to come in and say, I am the true God and there is none else. Now, I haven't counted up how many times that occurs, but you go through and count up, I am Yahweh and there is none else. I am Yahweh and there is none else. I am Yahweh and he's laboring who he is. There are no other gods. You'll notice in chapter 46 that he talks about Bel and Nebo. Bel and Nebo were the gods of Babylon. Okay, so you think that you're in Babylon and that the gods of Babylon have somehow contributed to your comfortability in Babylon? I tell you that Bel boweth down and Nebo stoopeth. They stoop, verse 2. They bow down together. They could not deliver the burden. Hearken unto me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, which are born by me from the belly. So Bel and Nebo are born by men's shoulders and carried around. They can't walk themselves. But I carry you, says Yahweh. Completely different. There is only one true God. And all the way through, we're in chapter 46, so have a look at verse 5. This is another phrase that comes out all the way through. To whom will you liken me and make me equal? That's another phrase to go through and colour in. I have no equal. There is no one else like me. You cannot compare me with any other God. I am the true God. So here's my proof, says God, that I am the true God. I've given two here. There are more that you could discover, but the two that I think stand out is the nation of Israel was protected by God. And of course, chapter 43 is one of the most powerful sections portraying this that we know, and we use this in lectures very often. You are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, in 43 verse 10. And my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am Yahweh, and beside me there is no Saviour. I have the ability to predict the future. All right, so look at verse 12. I have declared and have saved, and I have showed when there was no strange God among you. Therefore, you are my witnesses. He says it again back up in verse 9. Let all the nations be gathered together and let the people be assembled. Who among them can declare this and show us former things? Let them bring forth their witnesses. So you'll notice in verse 9 that there's two things mentioned there. Who among the nations can declare this? What do you think that's referring to? What declarations is he referring to, do you think? Because he goes on to say, and show us former things. So former things are things in the past, aren't they? So who can declare this is things future. Who can make declarations about the future? And who can show the purpose and direction of history, why it took the path that it did? Who can show us former things? So who has the ability to tell us the reason for the past and to predict the path of the future? Bring out your witnesses. It's like God going to the United Nations over there in New York and saying, bring forth your witnesses that you can tell why you've done this in the past and why you're going to do this in the future, and see how many of their plans actually come to pass, their 5-year plans, their 10-year plans. You know, where's Bosnia and where's Somalia and where's all of, Iraq and Afghanistan, and all these so-called witnesses that the United Nations can bring show that they cannot predict the future. God says, I can. Israel is my proof. You are my proof. And you are Israelites, so you know this. You know this. So God is giving them proof of his existence. I can declare the past and I can declare the future that comes all the way through. I remember doing a lecture once and I thought, I'm going to just stick between Isaiah 40 and 48. The title was, Who is the True God? Or something like that. And I thought, why do you have to go outside of Isaiah 40 to 48? It's all here, isn't it? The other thing that God predicted was a man called Cyrus. And some of you may have coloured in all the references to Cyrus in this section. Some of them he's named, but some of them he's not. Okay, he's talked about as a bird coming from the east, but he is actually named in chapter 44 and 45. And remember, Isaiah is writing this 100 years ago before Cyrus was even on the scene. And this would be the proof that God knew the future 100 years ago. So you'll notice that he's mentioned the very last verse of chapter 44, verse 28, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. See that? The word king's not used. He's not talked about as a king. Okay, he was Cyrus the Great, one of the greatest kings to ever have lived. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Thus saith Yahweh, chapter 45, verse 1, to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. So, Cyrus is predicted. And of course, there's Daniel seeing Cyrus starting to channel off the river Euphrates to divert the water. And of course, they came in under the two-leaf gates and they were able to come up into the city from the riverbed and open up the gate, and Babylon was taken in a night, Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar's feast, and it was all over by the morning. God predicted that. I will loose the loins of kings. Well, Belshazzar's knees were knocking, weren't they? To open before him the two-leaf gates, and the gates shall not be shut. This was God's proof. I am the true God. So that's what chapter 40 to 48 is really all about. Who is the true God? Because true servants will only serve the true God. We'll come to 48. I've just put round numbers there on the screen, but really the first section is chapter 40 to 48, verse 19. I just couldn't fit it on the screen because it would push it all out. And then, so when it says 40 to 48, that's really 48, verse 19. And the return home really does start 48, verse 20. 2 verses or 3 verses of the last chapter of 48 really belong to chapter 49, all right? And what you get in chapter 48, verse 20, which begins the return home section, so it's still about Babylon, but it's about leaving Babylon, because you get the command in 48, verse 20, to get out of Babylon. Go ye forth of Babylon, flee ye from the Chaldeans with a voice of singing, declare ye, tell this, utter it even to the end of the earth, say ye, Yahweh hath redeemed his servant Jacob. Get out of Babylon and go home. Cyrus given the decree. You can go home, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And so what you find is in this second half of the Babylon section is the, what was it, 46,000 or thereabouts? No, 42,000 thereabouts in Ezra that came back, plus all of the servants of Solomon and the Nethinim, etc., another 7,000 or so. So very small number now come back to the waste places of Jerusalem. And so you get this decree to return. It's mentioned twice. It's over in chapter 52 and verse 11. Depart ye, go ye out from thence. Touch no unclean thing. Go out of the midst of her. Be ye clean that bear the vessels of Yahweh. Remember, they were allowed to take the vessels back home. Ezra was bringing them back as well, bringing these vessels back, representing the time in captivity being over. Back they came, okay, but they didn't come back to a pretty place. Jerusalem was still burnt. It still had all its walls caved in, fallen down, gates were no longer there. And so I've just picked up 49, verse 19, and since we're in 52, We can have a look at this one. Just go back to the previous verse in verse 9. Break forth into joy, sing together, ye waste places of Jerusalem. So they come back to a pretty horrible setting from the comforts of Babylon. But you see, these are the true servants, or they want to be the true servants. They want to serve the one true God. The one true God has said, I am the one true God. I want to save you. I want you to come home. So the question really out of this first section is, will Israel serve God? Or have they really just brought Babylon back with them? Or are they going to worship God in the wrong way? That's really what's up for grabs still to come. Who's going to serve the true God properly? Well, one person is. He's called the true servant. Okay? The true servant. And so you will have remembered that we've talked about how the first half had 4 prophecies of the coming king, because it's all about kingship. Well, here we have in the second half 4 prophecies of the coming servant. But notice those 4 prophecies, those 4 songs only occur in this section. They don't occur in chapter 56 to 65. We'll see next week that there are 4 more songs in that section. So we'll save that for now. The servant songs are only in the Babylon section. Song 1 is when they're still in Babylon, chapter 42, which we had as our reading. Behold my servant. And I'm hoping that's our final hymn that we'll be singing tonight. And then songs 2, 3, and 4 are in the returning home section. Okay? So, has anyone coloured in the word servant in this section at all? I'd recommend colouring it in. The word servant comes up all the time. And I'm telling you the true servant here. But the question actually is, who is this true servant? And we've got a number of options, brothers and sisters. And I've put suggestions with verses next to them. And some of them clearly can't be anyone else but what I've put there as the suggestion. So one of them is that the servant is clearly national Israel, God's chosen servant, his firstborn son, nationally speaking. So 41 verse 8, just for example, but thou, Israel, art my servant. Pretty clear, can't deny that. Israel, art my servant. But have a look at verse 9, 41 verse 9. Who do you think this might be? Thou whom I have taken from the ends of the earth. The ends of the earth. Seems to have changed. And called thee from the chief men thereof, and said unto thee, thou art my servant. I have chosen thee, have not cast thee away. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee, yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand. Who's that? Well, come to chapter 42, verse 1, behold my servant whom I uphold. So that's the servant mentioned there that God upholds back in chapter 41, verse 10. The right hand of his righteousness. Doesn't tell you in 42 verse 1 who that is. Well, come over to chapter 45 verse 1, which we just read about Cyrus. Thus saith Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. So Cyrus could be the servant. He's clearly being presented as the servant who God holds his hand, upholds him with his hand. And so 41 verse 9 and 44 verse 26, Cyrus is the servant on occasions. I think Hezekiah in chapter 52, the servant song of the sufferings of the servant, clearly has an overtone of Hezekiah. You go through that chapter and it's Hezekiah in the first instance, I'm going to suggest. The Apostle Paul finds himself actually mentioned in chapter 49, verse 5 and 6. So Paul is the servant in chapter 49. In fact, chapter 49 and verse 6, the first half, I'm going to suggest, is done by one servant, Jesus Christ, and the second half is done by Paul, who is Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. So that role is split between Paul and his Lord. But I think Paul saw himself here in Isaiah 49. And of course, the 4 songs that we've already mentioned are all alerting and prophesying of Jesus Christ. So I'm not going to try and pin them down any further than that. I'm letting you understand that it's not an easy thing to know who the servant is in any given verse. But what we do know is that there are 4 songs of this coming servant. So I've just put the titles on there of each of the 4 songs, and each one is categorizing something about the servant, whether it's his calling in the first song, his mission in the second, his character in the third, and his sufferings in the fourth. Each one zones in on those aspects. All right? But the one that I want you to just go away from tonight thinking about more, because the servant, what a wonderful individual the Lord Jesus Christ was, both as a priest, a king, and a servant. We just want to focus in on him as a servant, and there's one characteristic that sort of leaps out about this servant. You get a hint of it in chapter 42 with the first song. It says in verse 3, "A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench." So he's going to look out for people. Bruised reed and smoking flax. But it's the third servant song that zones in on this characteristic of the servant as being the most compassionate being you'll have ever met. And I want you to take this away. This will come up in the second half, because if the true servant was compassionate, clearly the true servants must also be compassionate. So, just one verse in chapter 53. In chapter 50, I should say. Verse 4, "The Lord Yahweh hath given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how." Okay, so he's given me an education. He's taught me everything that he knows. But the one thing that gets mentioned, okay, in verse 4, out of all of the things he could be educated on, is how to speak a word in season to him that is weary. How to be kind and compassionate and reach out to those in need. That's the only characteristic that's mentioned about this servant. And this whole song is about how he's vindicated as being the true servant based on his characteristic of compassion. So let's leave it there for tonight. And God willing, next class, our final class, we will go into that last section and look at God's description of what he calls true